mention your speech, in which you talked about that took place in Strasbourg in December, and since that time, under Rule 147 of our revered Rules of Procedure, you have called before you 13 members of this Parliament to face disciplinary action. And it seems to me that this has been done on a pretty arbitrary basis. One of the ones that you called, Cathy Sinnott from our group, I doubt has ever shouted at anybody in her life. Another one of the members that you called to appear before the headmaster's study, an Austrian member, was actually in Frankfurt on the day, so he must have one hell of a voice, mustn't he? And I ask, why only 13? There were about 80 of us involved in these so-called disturbances. In fact, you named me yourself in the Conference of Presidents a debate, because the Minister didn't tell us any of the substance of the negotiations. But of course there is no debate, is there? No debate in the national parliaments, no informed opinion in the press, no debate at all. And why? Because this whole treaty is being put together in secret. And that is being done because you don't want to involve the citizens of Europe. You're fearful that the more they find out about your grandiose plans, the more likely they are to vote no. And what's worse still is the downright dishonesty with which this whole process is being pursued. For Angela Merkel, in a letter, to talk about the proposal, to use different terminology without changing the legal substance, I mean, it's Alice through the looking glass stuff, isn't it? It's the twisting of language. It is the deliberate attempt to stop there being free and fair referendums in European countries. It's your plan to act like a bulldozer, just to sweep aside the French referendum result, the Dutch referendum result, to pursue your political goals without taking the people with you. Moment for me in this House was we had the French say no, we had the Dutch say no, and then we had the Irish say no, and this Parliament has willfully carried on ignoring the wishes of the people. You just don't get it, do you? No means no. And it's truly incredible that 499 members of this House voted to ignore the Irish no vote and to continue with the treaty. What kind of a parliament is this? If you believed in democracy, you would not just bulldoze aside those 3 referendum results. And worse still, you are now so fearful of public opinion, you know that you're losing the argument, that you've sunk to abuse. I've had Mr Watson saying that I behave like an English football hooligan, when all I did was to gently point out that Commissioner Barrot is a convicted embezzler. Gary Titley said that I was a paranoid reactionary, living on the fringes of society. Well, I mean, he may have a point, I don't know. But Danny Cohn-Bendit, that great champion of free speech, said that opponents of the treaty were mentally ill. And Martin Schulz, the leader of the Socialists, saying after one of the no votes, we must not bow to populism, and that the no votes open the door to fascism. Well, I hope in the next 4 weeks in this campaign the voters of Europe can see the real face of this project. You are nationalistic, you are bullying, you are threatening, you are anti-democratic, you're a complete shower. To revive the EU constitution, but to do it in such a way that you want to avoid referendums in the key member states, is not just an insult to the French and the Dutch, but it's actually a classic example of the new phenomenon that I see all around me this morning, EU nationalism, where you never ever take no for an answer. But perhaps there's one small ray of hope from your speech this morning, Mrs Merkel, because you talked about freedom at great length, and I agree with you, it is important. And so I ask you, will you please allow the peoples of Europe to have the freedom to determine their own futures in free and fair referendums, and not to have this constitution foisted upon them? If you fail to do this, if you go on ignoring the peoples of Europe, you will breed and create the very intolerance, extremism and racism that you say yourself you wish to stop. For goodness sake, let the people speak. This morning, I thought this was going to be a big, proud moment. I mean, it's taken you 8.5 years of bullying, of lying, of ignoring democratic referendums. 8.5 years it's taken you to get this treaty through, and on the 1st of December, you will have it. And of course, the architect of all of this, Giscard, wanted from this constitutional treaty for the European Union to have a big global voice. But I'm afraid the leaders have suffered from a collective loss of nerve. They've decided that they want their faces to be up on the global stage, not somebody from the European Union, and so we've got appointed a couple of political pygmies. And we have a new President of Europe, Herman Van Rompuy. Doesn't exactly trip off the tongue, does it? I can't see him stopping the traffic in Beijing or Washington. I doubt anybody in Brussels would even recognise who he is. And yet, he's going to be paid a salary that is bigger than Obama's, which tells you all you need to know about this European political class and how they look after themselves. But at least he's an elected politician, unlike Baroness Cathy Ashton, who really is the true representation of the modern day political class. In some ways she's ideal, isn't she? She's never had a proper job, and she's never been elected to anything in her life. So I guess she's perfect. No. But I mean, she's never been elected to anything, and no one knows who she is. Even the Prime Minister was talking about Baroness Ashdown as opposed to Ashton. I mean, no one has ever heard of her. She's even less well known than Herman Van Rompuy. I mean, that takes some doing, doesn't it? So here she is. Never stood for public office, never had a proper job, and here she gets one of the top jobs in the Union. Her appointment is an embarrassment for Britain. But it's much worse. Well, at least I've been elected, sir. Unlike her, she's not been elected, and the people don't have the power to remove her. But with respect, I think you've completely missed the point. Because twice you said the people that were elected last week. They have not been elected. That is the point that I'm making. And in the case of Baroness Ashton, she has never been elected to public office in her entire life. She takes an enormously powerful job, and the peoples of Europe, of Britain, of everywhere else do not have the power to hold her to account and to remove her. And that fundamentally is what is wrong with this whole European Union. It's all about bureaucracy versus democracy. Things have gone horribly, horribly wrong. Started today, didn't we, with the anthem. This is the same flag and anthem that you said had been dropped after the French and Dutch very sensibly said no to the dreaded EU constitution. You're not even pretending anymore. You're pushing ahead with all the symbols of statehood and trying at the same time to lie and cheat with the Irish by giving them a series of guarantees that are not worth the paper that they are written on. Well, I can tell you that many of us in this Europe of Freedom and Democracy group will do all we can to help the no side in that Irish referendum. The future of European democracy rests very heavily on Irish shoulders. You fought, Mr. President, against the Soviet Union. You fought for democracy. You fought for national self-determination. If you continue to ignore the democratic voice of countries like France, the Netherlands and Ireland, then you will turn the European Union back into that very union that you fought so hard against. Listen to the people, please. Thank you, everybody. When we had a president, we'd see a giant global political figure. The man that would be the political leader for 500 million people. The man that would represent all of us on the world stage. The man whose job was so important that, of course, you're paid more than President Obama. Well, I'm afraid what we got was you. And I'm sorry, but after that performance earlier that you gave, and I don't want to be rude, but you know, really, you have the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. And the question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask is, who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you. I would like to ask you, President, who voted for you? And what mechanism? Oh, I know democracy is not popular with you lot. And what mechanism do the peoples of Europe have to remove you? Is this European democracy? Well, I sense, though, that you're competent and capable and dangerous, and I have no doubt that it's your intention to be the quiet assassin of European democracy and of the European nation states. You appear to have a loathing for the very concept of the existence of nation states. Perhaps that's because you come from Belgium, which of course is pretty much a non-country. But since you took over, we've seen Greece reduced.
Nigel Farage.
In generations to come, children will be told a story. They'll be told that once upon a time, Europe was divided. There was a big wall down the middle of it, and the people in the East were very poor, and they had no democracy, and they lived under an evil system called communism that killed millions of its own people. But joy of joys, the wall came down, and we finished up with 27 nations, and those people lived in democracy, and 500 million people lived in peace. But sadly, no, there is more. I promise you, there's more. Thank you. I should just sit down now. Well, I must say, that's the first time I've ever received such applause, and I'm tempted, Mr. Verhofstadt, I am tempted to sit down, but if I may, sadly, the story continues. The politicians in charge became very greedy, and they wanted money for themselves, and they wanted power, and so they resorted to lies and deceit, and they staged the most spectacular bureaucratic coup d'etat that the world had ever seen. But they didn't need to use any bullets to do it. They were much cleverer, much more scheming than that. No, what they did is they put in place a new treaty. It was called the Lisbon Treaty. And then they gave 27 people total unlimited power. These were to be the people that made all the laws. Of course, they already had a flag and they already had an anthem, but they went about building a new state. But they ignored the people. And what they did, whether they knew it or not, is they recreated the very evil system that the people in Eastern Europe had lived under before. But the incredible thing was that many of the new bosses had also worked for that same evil system before. Well, of course, the plan was flawed, and their fanciful monetary scheme collapsed. But still, the new bosses wouldn't listen to the people. No, They made life tougher and tougher. They put tens of millions into poverty. They denied people a say. And in the end, those people had to resort to violence to get back their nation states and their democracy. And the moral of the story is they had learnt nothing from history. Members of the European
Mr. President.
Before you give this Commission power, remember that 60 years
Mr. President.
ago, an Iron Curtain came down on Europe.
That now, Mr. President.
With this Commission, there is an economic iron fist, and it's being felt in Greece today. We cannot build.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. Thank you very much.
This is not possible, please. Take